Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all today. Thank you for coming to our session on heat decarbonisation and exchanging the Dutch and British perspectives on this significant challenge. My name is Pedro Gertler. I am the program leader for heat, cooling and energy efficiency at the independent climate think tank E3G. We are co-hosting this event with the Embassy of the Netherlands to the United Kingdom. And we are delighted to be talking about this very topical issue, made even more topical today by the fact that we've had some interesting announcements here in the UK around heat decarbonisation and many other green issues. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you to the Ambassador, Carl van Ostrom, to the United Kingdom, who will make some opening remarks. And with that, I would like to hand to you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Pedro, and let me begin by thanking E3G for the wonderful work you're doing. We also have a bit of a wider context today that this event takes place in the London Climate Action Week, and certainly also we have people from London here. It's very important that we have this Climate Action Week. For me, the fight against climate change is almost personal. Until 2 months ago, I was our ambassador to New York, to the United Nations in New York. And I was the guy who signed the Dutch accession to the climate treaty a little over 4 years ago. And I think what binds us together today is how we can use this discussion today to contribute to the fight against climate change. And of course, the topical issue is heat decarbonisation, which in our view is an essential part of the energy transition as part of the fight against climate change. And certainly I think it's crucial the people we have brought together today is a group of people of governments and companies, private sector, semi-government, semi-private sector, because that partnership is crucial in realizing the energy transition. I apologize, you're not in my home. Let me just, for the record, invite you somewhere next year after COVID. We do this really live in my home, and we have a nice real life session. And I think all of us are frustrated on the one hand that it's not possible to meet live, but at the other side, it's very convenient that so quickly we can bring this wonderful group of people together. So let me say a few words, and I use the 3C model, the C of climate smart heating, the C of change, and the C of cooperation. On climate smart heating, let me say a few words on what we've done in Holland, and certainly some of the colleagues who will speak later from the Netherlands will elaborate on that. In the Netherlands, we're moving from heating our buildings with natural gas, which we've done since the early 60s, and enormous gas finds in Groningen. We're moving to move out from the gas heating system. So we're developing a wide range of new sustainable solutions like electric heat pumps, biogas, other options. And in the Netherlands, we have a very ambitious goal, which is to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 49% in 2030 compared to 1990 levels. So that means that we need separate decarbonizing measures for most buildings, and that's an enormous task which is ahead of us. And we try, in the Netherlands, we try to increase scale and to reduce cost. And one of our colleagues from the Netherlands who is here is a colleague from the Ministry of the Interior from The Hague, and that's a ministry which is developing a district-oriented approach, providing neighborhoods with these sustainable alternatives I just mentioned. Also with us, we have the city of Groningen, which is making the transition on the level of a Dutch municipality towards a more sustainable neighborhood policy. And it's part of a wider effort of more municipalities working together to achieve more sustainability. And we also, of course, we have energy companies, grid operators, and other organizations, including the private sector, trying to make our built and building environment more sustainable, with as common denominator climate smart heating. Then my second point is the C of change. C comes after the B in the Dutch alphabet, and the B, of course, stands for Brexit. This is, I think, now 48 days left before the 1st of January, when the end of the transition period is there. I think today shows that also in a post-Brexit world, as North Sea neighbors, the United Kingdom and the Kingdom of the Netherlands, we can profit from each other's experiences and we can work together to address our common challenges. At the same time, things will be different. Even traveling next year might be more different than it would have been if you would have come this year. So my advice is to all of you, certainly from the Netherlands, if you're participating in this seminar, if you're government, if you're private sector, if you're semi-government, semi-private, do the Brexit scan, go to the Brexit desk website, brexitloket.nl, and there you can really do a very quick self-scan, what it means for you or for your organization, what will change. And certainly travel will change, and if you're a company, there will be elaborate customs procedures. And let's all, I think all of us hope that it will be a deal Brexit on the 1st of January, and it will not be a no deal, because then even our current day cooperation might be in jeopardy. My third and last point, continued cooperation. As I mentioned, we face the same challenges. We have both sides of the North Sea, but global challenges are the same for us. And the common solutions are also for us. And that certainly is the climate smart way we try to implement the Paris Agreement. And it's on many other issues as well. So we will continue to build and develop the bilateral relationship between the United Kingdom and the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And also within the European Union, we will continue to be your best friends in the coming years to come, such as you were our best friends at the time the UK was still in the European Union. In summing up at the end, climate smart heating is the future. We need continued cooperation on the one hand between governments, national and local, but also the private sector and semi-private sector. And we need continued cooperation across the North Sea between these wonderful friends, which we will continue to be as North Sea neighbors. And let's continue to work on our common challenges and our common agenda. And once again, a shout out to Pedro with his beautiful background behind him, and E3G for the very important work you're doing to make sure that our planet remains safe and we achieve sustainability and we implement the agreements under the Paris agreements. Thank you so much, Pedro, and welcome to you all.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. You have set the scene for today's session wonderfully. We need to look at the bigger picture. With that, I would like to briefly explain the structure of today's session. We will have 3 pairs of panelists, the national government, local government, and industry perspectives. And after each of those pairs have made their opening remarks, we will hand over to you on the floor, the audience, to contribute questions. There is a Q&A box which we'd like you to put questions in. If your question is directed to a specific speaker or panelist, then please specify and we will make sure that the question is put to the panelist directly. Otherwise, panelists will both be able to respond in each case. And with that, I'd like to introduce the first pair of panelists, which is from the national government perspective. First up, we will have Danny Newport. He's the head of the Heat and Building Strategy at the UK government's Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And after that, we will hear from Ferdi Licher. He is the Director of Buildings and Energy at the Interior Ministry of the Netherlands. With that, I would like to hand over to Danny to commence the first panel. Over to you, Danny.
Thanks, Pedro, and thanks, Ambassador Carroll. The first thing I guess I wanted to say was it's a real pleasure today speaking to this particular audience, and I think we're in absolutely no danger of not working closely between the UK and the Netherlands. One of the things that I was reflecting on preparing for today was that I've been working on the agenda of decarbonisation within UK government for about 12 years now, and 8 of which have been spent on heat and buildings decarbonisation. And I think one of the most frequent questions I've had from ministers and political advisors whenever we send up advice on new endeavours and new policies is, yes, this is all very good, but what are they doing in the Netherlands? And I think that speaks to the conscious acknowledgement within government of just how close partners we are, both in terms of the challenges that we face, but also in terms of our motivations and actions. So it doesn't just reflect the sort of high regard for good Netherlands sense. The challenges we face on decarbonising our buildings are as similar, I think, as any countries. There are huge similarities in terms of our current heating patterns. We're two of the most prevalent gas users for heating our buildings, and gas presents a unique challenge to decarbonisation, but some unique opportunities as well. We both use about 80%, I think, of our buildings are connected to some form of gas grid for heating. We have similar climates, of course, and similar needs from heating our buildings. And, you know, actually our buildings are not so very different either, as if you look at it in a global context. You know, we're dealing with, many of our buildings are old and therefore not built to sort of current standards. And the retrofit challenge, I think, is enormous on both fronts. But I think the other reason we look to the Netherlands often as a source of inspiration is that we see them really as a country that is at the forefront of leadership on decarbonisation. So we work very closely on issues like how to deploy heat networks, low carbon heat networks, something we learn a lot from close working across the private and public sectors. Green gas, biogas in particular, is another area where I think we've seen really close collaboration. And of course, as I said, we have similar challenges on retrofit and moving away from using natural gas, and the opportunities that we are looking at around increasing insulation of buildings, around deployment of heat pumps, and potentially around low carbon gases in the future are also, of course, very similar, even if we have some different perspectives on some of those opportunities. The other reason, of course, it's exciting to speak today, as has been mentioned already, is that today is I think, an enormous day for the UK in terms of our climate action. The Prime Minister will later be delivering his 10-point plan for net zero, and heat and buildings is an area which features prominently within that. I think this culmination of an enormous amount of effort across all of government. I'm sure many of my colleagues on different decarbonisation agendas will be equally excited by today's announcements. But on heat and buildings, there is some really big stuff in there. Bringing forward new build standards so that we stop building homes that will later require retrofits to be carbon neutral. So we're looking at now 2023 as an implementation date for all buildings to be ready for net zero without further retrofit. We've announced extensions of a lot of the green stimulus package that we announced over the summer going into next year, so that we're offering grants across all houses, but particularly also focused on those who need government support the most, the fuel poor, vulnerable groups, social housing and public sector. We've announced a real step change in ambition on low carbon heating in two senses. So we currently have quite a small market actually in the UK for heat pumps. We're quite a long way, I think, behind the market growth in the Netherlands on that front. But we've announced today that we want to grow the market for low carbon electric heat pumps in the UK to 600,000 a year by 2028, which is in comparison to the annual boiler sales of about 1.5 million per year. So, you know, it's not getting us all the way there, but it's an enormous growth on what we do today. We've also announced our intention to trial hydrogen for heating and the funding that we're putting into that, so that we move through the gears on realising the potential for using low carbon hydrogen as an alternative to natural gas. So those are some really big, I think, step change announcements in ambition from national government. But I think the final set of reflections are around the fact that that is the first steps in what is an enormous challenge to 2050. Decarbonising buildings is about 20% of the UK's emissions. It's obviously more personal to a lot of people than a lot of the rest of the decarbonisation agenda. It requires changes to people's homes. It requires changes to people's behaviours, and bringing the public with us is going to be crucially important. It also poses enormous infrastructural challenges. To speak frankly, our national infrastructure is not fit for purpose at the moment to run all of our buildings on low carbon heating. And those challenges mean that we need to move forward in a way that harnesses not just central government's efforts, but also those of the public, those of local actors, and those of the private sector. One of the things that will follow the 10-point plan that's been announced today is a comprehensive heat and buildings strategy, which is what my team work on in the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. That is a strategy which will outline the detail that sits behind the ambitions announced today. It's also one which will talk about what the announcements today don't do, but what further work is required to get us on a path to net zero. And there are some big challenges and big decisions within that. We think over the next decade, we need to spend about £100 billion to be on track to net zero, just in terms of improving our heating and buildings. And that is just simply not something that central government is going to be able to do on its own. It's going to require enormous contributions from the private sector, from building owners, from house owners. It is also going to require enormous collaboration with local actors who ultimately are the best source of information on what is necessary, what are the necessary interventions, both from an infrastructure perspective, but also an integration perspective in local areas. So we're going to be outlining our thoughts on that and how we take those decisions and those operations forward in a way which is even more collaborative than we've seen to date. So I think that's all I wanted to say by way of sort of opening remarks. I look forward to the rest of the session, and happy to answer any questions as they come.
Thank you very much, Danny. We will hold over questions until after the next speaker has made his remarks. So with that, I would like to hand over to Ferdi Licher to add the Dutch national government perspective. Thank you, Danny.
Yes, hello everybody from the Netherlands. I'm the director for the energy transition in the Netherlands. And maybe Corona times helps us to discuss a little bit more intense with each other. Normally we don't have time traveling abroad. Maybe you recognize that we do know very little about what is happening in the countries around us. And what we see is that citizens do catch up with some of the good examples abroad. And also our representatives in Parliament are asking us why we don't follow the UK with their voucher system. And so this international context of climate change and climate policies asks for much more intense dialogue between countries. And as I said, Corona times might help because traveling time is always difficult. It's difficult to organize. And with this kind of webinars, it's just so easy to talk more often with each other. So the initiative is very good. There is a small presentation. Maybe someone can put the slides on. Is there a slide? Okay. Yeah, well, you can go to the next slide. Yeah, well, just to say a few words about the Dutch building stock. Of course, we have a smaller building stock than in the UK. We have around 8 to 9 million buildings, of which 1 million commercial buildings, around 8 million residential housing. And most of them are connected to natural gas networks and have boiler heating. We have only about 400,000 houses connected to a district heating system. And heat pumps is almost a rare phenomenon in the Netherlands until now. It's growing very fast, especially in the new housing construction, with around 50,000 every year. But still, we have to scale up this possibility in changing the boiler heating with the heat pump systems. So we have around 20% really low energy performing buildings with an energy certificate E, F, G is around 20% in the Netherlands. Then we have a middle category, is around 60% is with an energy certificate B, C, or D. And then we have around 20% with an energy certificate A or A plus or plus plus. So if you look at this 20% and not well performing residential homes, this is around 1.5 million of the total building stock in the Netherlands, in which we can improve the energy performance by huge steps and decarbonize quickly. This is like a little bit starting. We have many housing corporations in the Netherlands too, which of course are very important in our strategy. Next slide. So this is what we call the house of Diederik Samson. He is working closely to Frans Timmermans in the European Commission right now on the European Green Deal. And he's a little bit like taking our model with him to Brussels and via Brussels to the rest of Europe. What you see in these building blocks for our climate agreement, that we have to reduce 3.4 megatons in 2030. How much is that? It's not that much. We were at 30 megatons in 1990. We have to move to 15, around 15 in 2030. So that is this 49% of reduction. Around 2020, so right now we are at 25. So what we did in the last 30 years is 5 megatons. And what we have to do is 10 megatons in the next 10 years. So from this perspective, we have to go 6 times as fast as we went until now. So 3.4, so if you regard this to the 30 megatons in 2000 or in 1990 is not so much, but if you consider that it took us 30 years to do 5 megatons, 3.4 is quite a lot in 10 years time. It is, and the main part of these megatons we are going to realize in the residential buildings, which is equalized more or less to 1.5 residential homes. So this is, in some sense, more or less equal to what I said before, that the 1.5 million with the low energy certificates. But how do we think we are going to do this? Well, you see in this house, we have on the basis, we have tax shift, cost reduction, subsidies, and financing schemes. So what we believe is that we have to do 2 things. We have to lower the costs, and we have to improve the financial and subsidies and the incentives to move. And at the moment, the energy prices are quite low. So the incentives are not so strong at the moment to move, but we think it's a very important key in the strategy of Europe and of the Netherlands. So we see this discussion in Europe, of course, too, on the ETS system, CO2 taxes. There is, however, a difficult discussion about these incentives, because people in low performing buildings from an energy perspective often don't have the investment capacity to improve their situation. So they will then pay, of course, if we introduce higher taxes on natural gas, they will pay the bill for the energy and do have even less money to invest in the energy performance improvement. So there is some kind of dilemma there, even if we think it's an important key. In the middle, you see the district-oriented approach and the general approach. So maybe just to start, in the general approach, we introduced in 2018 the requirement to build every new home without natural gas. And we will build around 1 million houses until 2030, 2040. So this is almost automatically now, from now on. We are already around 90 to 95% now in new buildings without natural gas. So this is the general approach on the new buildings. Then we have, as a main approach, the district-oriented approach. This means that every municipality in the Netherlands will have to have a plan at the end of 2021 on how to move in every district, every neighborhood, from natural gas to another solution. And this has to count up to at least 1.5 million houses in 2030. And as it takes around 6 to 8 years of time to change the infrastructure from natural gas to another solution, we need to decide on a municipal level quite quickly what to do. Of course, it's logical to choose the cheapest solutions, the most evident solutions, the most affordable solutions, and to start with those neighborhoods and those housing types where you can gain quite a lot from the CO2 emission reduction perspective. But as the whole building and philosophy starts from cost reduction and from tax shifts, which we'll realize over time. So that means that it will get affordable for people. It's not affordable for many people at the moment, but it will be affordable for people maybe later on, from 2025 to 2030, if we realize cost reductions of 30%. But this means if we start in this district-oriented approach, you start now, you start your discussion now and your dialogue with the citizens right now. And there is a gap between what it costs and what you gain from on your saving on your energy bill. So it's a difficult discussion. We are quite in the middle of it. Important is that we started with around 50 pilots with all kind of heat solutions, a competition between municipalities on plans how to move away from natural gas and introduce other solutions. We have done 2 rounds right now, 27 municipalities selected in the first round and another 23 in the second round. And we build up to 50 of these examples. And as there are around 350 municipalities in the Netherlands, 1 out of 7 now has started with some kind of pilot project from which we want to learn for broadening and scale up this approach. We have we have the district-oriented approach. We have also a starting motor and renovation accelerator approach with the housing corporations. They will do, we expect they will do around 900,000 houses, so around 60% of the 1.5 million. until 2030. So they are like the locomotive of the transition. They have similar housing types, so there should be possible some kind of standardization and cost reduction there. And we are organizing tenders and competitions to scale up on certain building types. And the third is the campaigning subsidy of the individual and private home owner to stimulate investments in what is profitable and to introduce some kind of standard also on the installation of homes preparing for the future at natural moments. For example, if you buy a house or you rebuild a house or you renovate a home, we have around 160,000 of these transactions on the housing market. So if every one of these transactions would be together with banks and mortgages and so on to finance investments in the basis for the future, that would be some kind of in the general approach, a very important one to get to the 1.5 million houses natural gas free. Okay, maybe the next slide. Well, maybe also related to the former slide, it is very much about the costs. So we have invested in the last 2 years around 200 million euros in innovation projects. So added with the private investments, it's about 1 billion euros we invest in silent, smaller, better heat pumps, but also in all kind of other innovation and sustainable concepts. We expect a lot of it, and we hope that we can sell some of this innovation in the UK too in the future. So cost is very important from the innovation perspective. Cost, of course, is very important from the home owner perspective and the affordability. We are calculating in many ways. So from a conceptual point of view, you should only calculate the additional costs of a sustainable renovation, but most people just can't, of course, the real investments done in a certain moment, combining the more the referential costs and the additional costs, so to say. So there is so how do we treat this issue of the affordability? Politics ask us to guarantee some kind of cost equality, so you don't pay more than you paid in the past, but we don't have the budgets to guarantee that. So this will be one of the main issues, I think, also for the next government to deal with. Do we guarantee like cost neutrality or some kind of cost equality from the old to the new, or do we just guarantee that for the most vulnerable and low income situations? And the other one is, do we introduce legislation and requirements for certain type of installations, for certain times of moments in time, if you make a renovation, or the moment we have the district-oriented approach, we change the infrastructure, can we put requirements on individual home owners, or we just try to seduct them with subsidies and financing schemes? But yeah, well, how do you treat who's not willing or remains behind? We think from a policy perspective, it's very good to introduce requirements, especially for the long future, so you can prepare to the adjustment or the adaptation to these requirements on a logical moment, a natural moment of renovation or transaction on the housing market. But often yeah, in politics is of course also together with your affordability a highly political issue. So this is maybe just for the start for the discussion, and yeah, I'm interested to hear what questions or remarks you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ferdi. Yeah, we picked up on a number of questions. Quite a few have been answered also. You can see the answers given in the Q&A box. There are two kind of areas that have come up thematically in quite a few questions that have been asked. One of them is around, and this goes to both of you, Danny and Ferdi, hydrogen, green hydrogen is potentially quite a scarce resource, has an important role to play in decarbonising hard to decarbonise sectors of the economy. How are you looking at managing the expectations and the use of that in the heating space? And I guess related to that is quite the question of managing the risks of things not working out, whether that's on cost or technical feasibility. So the risk of failure and how you manage that. And then a somewhat connected question is one that's come up around what's your perspective on phasing out, in a regulatory way, phasing out the installation of new fossil heating systems in existing buildings. So I'll ask, if possible, for both of you to respond quite briefly so that we can move on to the next panel and we can pick up some of these themes again in the plenary discussion at the end. But if you have some initial reflections on those two kind of themes.
Thanks, Pedro. Shall I go first? So I think the hydrogen question is a really good one, and frankly, it's not one that we're going to answer today in full. But look, there are similar challenges around all of the options, I think, on decarbonising heating. Electrifying the UK's building stock in total will bring enormous infrastructural challenges. It will bring enormous challenges around generation capacity. And there's a question of the suitability of the UK's building stock. So I think there are questions on both sides. I think the questions and challenges that are being raised around hydrogen are entirely valid. And I think that's why, at the moment, we're saying we have to embrace a risk of failure on any one option for decarbonising heat, but we are best to pursue a mixed portfolio so that we are managing that risk at the highest possible level. So that's why, in the 10-point plan today, we're announcing both a massive ramp up in electrification industry, but at the same time, really committing to the serious R&D work that is required to realise the potential for hydrogen for heating. That doesn't answer the question of, how many homes could be serviced by one or the other today, but it does set us on a course to answer those questions by hopefully around the middle of this decade, so that the legwork that we're doing now can then be turned into a definitive strategy for how we're going to either mix those options or utilise those options across the whole building stock. On the implications for fossil fuel boilers in existing homes. So look, I think I answered in the conversation. It's clearer for us for those homes that aren't already on the gas grid in terms of what the right answer is for those homes. It is largely going to be electrification, and that's why this year we hope to publish the consultation that we announced in the Clean Growth strategy around how we will go about phasing out the installation of new oil and high carbon fossil fuel systems off the gas grid. On the gas grid, I think there is a clear implication that if we want to be able to use natural market triggers, natural replacement cycles, we are 2 replacement cycles away from 2050. And that means that actually right now, we're entering probably the last replacement cycle for traditional natural gas boilers, because the next replacement cycle, which starts in maybe 10 to 15 years' time, is either going to have to be low carbon heating systems replacing those gas boilers, or we are going to end up with a challenge of needing to remove boilers that are still functional in order to meet 2050. So I think that sets a very clear parameter. We'll see where we get with the heat and building strategy in terms of the sort of equivalencies to low carbon vehicles, but I think that logic is inescapable.
Thank you.
Maybe
Ferdi,
I can add to that. The hydrogen discussion is a very important one in the Netherlands too. Many hope that hydrogen will be available and affordable in around 10 years time. But in our vision, it is not impossible that it could be affordable and available. But still, the building sector will not be the first sector to move the hydrogen to. So we have the heavy industry, we have the heavy transport sector. We have there is not a wide world global market on hydrogen from which we can rely on. So what we say is waiting is no option, and where there are other options, hydrogen will not be an option anyway. So, and this last message, I think, is an important one. So that means that from a strategic perspective and stepwise approach, you will start where you have alternatives which are affordable and feasible and right on this moment. And there's, if you choose well, I think the risk of failure is not that high. I think it's an important criteria for your decision making. It should be as good as remorse-free what you choose to do first in any scenario, and you just need to do 10 to 20% in the coming years. So it should be possible to select neighborhoods, systems, options which are remorse-free for the coming 10 years, and then we know probably a little bit more, and then we take our next steps. On the other hand, those who are in a pilot neighborhood or are in the first phase of the transition might have not all the advantages of the best technology and the best price. So we need to help and support these first movers in the energy transition. I think that's very important also for the, how do you call it, the positive image of the energy transition. If we fail in the first neighborhoods, if we fail in with the first movers, then we will, then the energy transition will slow down and stuck in mud. So, and maybe the last question, I'm not sure if I understood it quite well, but we think it's very important to have a good strategy on the transformation from the natural gas boilers to the hybrid heat pumps. That would be like with cars, the logical thing to do. And even is that price-wise, it's not always maybe the most logical option for most households. We see that they when they buy a kitchen, they don't choose for the gas option. They choose for the electric and the induction option. That's around level at 80% already, even if they have natural gas in their homes. So that should be also the choice which people make in a few years' time. And we're working with the private sector to make sure that also in this case, this transformation will start there where it's most logical, most affordable. And subsidies should maybe narrow the gap to scale up.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very interesting about the induction hobs. I will move on without further ado to the next panel, and we'll pick up some of these themes again at the end. So, as I say, I'd like to introduce the two panelists. First up, we will have Shirley Rodrigues, who is the London Deputy Mayor for Environment and Energy. She's been that since October of 2016. And after Shirley, we will hear from Wouter van Bolhuis, who's the Energy Program Manager of Groningen Municipality. And I've got some exciting work to talk about as well. So that, without further ado, I'll hand over to Shirley.
Thank you for that introduction and for inviting me just to talk a little bit about what we're doing in London. And I've been really enjoying hearing what the two previous speakers have been saying about their approaches. And it is a really exciting day in London, in the UK, with the 10-point plan being published. There are obviously some further questions on that, so I'll probably come to that in the speech. And obviously we know that decarbonising heat and transport are now our most pressing challenges that we're facing as we tackle the climate emergency. And we believe in London, and I think with many other local authorities, that these are best coordinated and delivered at a local level. And this is because the social and economic benefits of decarbonising our heat and retrofitting our buildings are huge. They help address fuel poverty, create jobs, support local businesses and supply chains, and this is really important locally. A key issue obviously is for government to set a comprehensive and integrated policy and regulatory framework and then devolve powers and funds to cities. So today's announcement is welcome. We're looking forward to seeing the detail, and with our comprehensive spending review shortly, looking to see how that translates into funding, particularly for local authorities and cities like London. In London, the Mayor Sadiq Khan has set an ambition for London to be a net zero carbon city by 2030. And some might think this isn't achievable, but as you know, the science around the climate emergency really demands that this generation of leaders has such ambition. It's absolutely our responsibility to try. And a key issue that was a big issue in itself, but obviously now we have to deal with the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, and they're intrinsically linked. Sadiq has been very clear that London's recovery must be green, just and inclusive, and it should lead to a renewed drive to tackle the climate and ecological emergencies and air pollution. We've set up a London Recovery Board, which is co-chaired by the Mayor, but also the leader of London's local authorities. There are 33 of them in London. And together we've established 9 missions to frame that recovery, one of which is a Green New Deal. And the environment is a cross-cutting principle that underpins all of those 9 missions. To support the Green New Deal mission, the Mayor's announced a 3-year multi-million-pound fund designed to tackle the emergency, create jobs and support that just transition. And one of the priorities for this fund is the decarbonisation of our buildings and promoting heat networks and renewable energy. And the recovery that we're aiming to engender is being built off a lot of good work we've already been doing in London. We've set a 1.5-degree climate action plan compatible with the Paris Agreement that sets a minimum trajectory for our climate ambitions. We have 3 5-yearly carbon budgets starting in 2018 and then 2023 and 2028. And they set minimum reduction targets of 40%, 50% and 60% respectively. We've already peaked our emissions. We're one of the few global cities that have done that. In 2017, our carbon dioxide emissions equivalent were 30.3 million tonnes, which is a 33% reduction on 1990 levels. And heat makes up around 1/3 of those emissions. And by the mid-2020s, we aim to be retrofitting at least 160,000 homes a year. That's 4 times faster than anything we've achieved before. The caveat on that obviously is making sure that we have the powers and resources to do that from government, but we've been working hard to mobilise private sector finance as well. And thanks to our European Commission colleagues, we have a number of projects that are focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We have an accelerator on, we call the Local Energy Accelerator, which is supporting the rollout of low temperature, low carbon district energy networks. And that's currently supporting 16 projects. We have a Homes and Workplaces Accelerator, which is developing retrofit projects. The Homes programme has already supported over 32,000 homes, saving over 12,000 tonnes of carbon. And our Workplaces Accelerators has retrofitted around 270 public sector buildings and delivered over 850 solar PV installs. And we've heard from Danny about the Future Home Standard. We've already got one of those in London that has been operating since 2016 for residential buildings very successfully. And we're now proposing to extend that standard to commercial buildings, so all new development basically. And the success of this is that in 2019, our policies secured carbon savings of 40% above that required by current building regulations. So in the order of 33,500 tonnes of CO2, and that's something we're really, we're really pushing government to make sure that there's no rowing back on the level of regulation that has been set in London. So in terms of what might be holding us back, we're clear that we can't deliver a zero carbon London alone. So what we've been asking, and not just us, but also the other metro mayors, the other mayors of major UK cities and local authorities are asking that we are given more powers and funding, in particular control over setting energy efficiency standards and the ability to fund proposed decarbonisation strategies in defined zones, so that this is picked up in the next comprehensive spending review period. This would allow us to drive local demand for decarbonisation and design and coordinate activity responding to local needs, and enable us to aggregate government funding streams and our own to attract additional public and private sector finance. And secondly, we really need an integrated policy and regulatory framework that creates the market structure to support innovative deployment of locally developed low carbon solutions. One of the issues that we flagged with government is the impending withdrawal of the non-domestic renewable heat incentive, and that really risks stalling all momentum on large-scale heat decarbonisation. So we're really hoping that that is reversed. And we're really anticipating the heating and building strategy that Danny talked about. So we're really hoping that signals the change that we need. So I hope this has given you just a bit of a glimpse on what we're doing in London and what we need from government to enable cities to play a leading role in decarbonising heat. We have a proven track record that shows that when cities are empowered, they do deliver. And this shows both leadership and creates a template for the rest of the country. But very importantly, in the run up to COP26, it would be a really great signal to be able to take action in these areas. And of course, as we recover from the pandemic, green policies, including decarbonisation of heat, will be central to building a fairer, cleaner and more equal city for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shirley. It really crystallises how driving this agenda forward can deliver on so many different objectives simultaneously, and the urgency comes through really clearly there. I will move swiftly on to Wouter. So Wouter, I'll hand over to you now to give us your perspective from Groningen. Thank you, Shirley.
Hello, thank you very much. I'd like to tell something about the city of Groningen. We're, I think, a front runner on energy transition in the Netherlands, but we have some challenges everybody has in the Netherlands, every municipality. So I will tell something about it with some sheets, and I will share it now. I think it will do. We've got quite a long time of program of energy, and we want to get rid of natural gas, not only because CO2 ambitions, but also because we've got a lot of earthquakes in Groningen because of gas extraction. What did we do? We did a lot of investigating and modeling because we know we want to get rid of natural gas. And we were natural gas, and you see on the map, it has different colors. We did a lot of investigation and modeling, and we said what will be the best solution, alternative solution on a district level. So we did an investigation for 138 districts, and the outcome is a heat grid. It's in the red, more high-dense districts. The newer districts are blue, fully electric, and the countryside and the villages in our municipality will be a hybrid system with green gas, I think. And this is, it looks quite simple on the map, but it means a lot of thinking and about financing and technical options. And if we zoom in, Ferdi Licher told us already about 50 pilots. Well, we will show you one of the pilots in the northwest of the city. And when we zoom in, we see in one neighborhood, we've got 2 district heating systems already. And that's quite remarkable, we think, but we think for a pilot, it's also very well to choose on different horses, you could say. As a city, we started in 2014 a new public company, Warmtestad, Heat City, and they are developing a heat grid, high temperature for apartment buildings. And they are digging and working all together. Well, you see it on the map. What they are doing, they are making a big tube alongside all the big buildings in the neighborhood. And it goes well with a lot of problems, but it works. And what's happening next, you see all those buildings, you see we're missing a lot of buildings. And there are the buildings from the other citizens, the ground-based houses. And they say, what about us? You forgot us. So what did they do? They started their own cooperation with help now from us and from Shell also. And we said, yeah, you're right. We have to think also for something, an alternative on a heat grid for the ground-based houses. And that is what's happening in Groningen. You see in the other districts, they are many ground-based houses over there. And well, we said, what should we do? We also are developing and designing at the moment a low temperature heat grid. And that's quite interesting. There are 2 systems, and how do they talk to each other, and what will happening. Well, that about techniques and what's happening next. What does it cost? Well, you see some prices up front for a heat grid. And you see Warmtestad is taking the sweet, we could say, in the neighborhood, and they do not pick the sour, because as a government of a municipality, we say to Warmtestad, you have to deal with a business case. We've got no extra money. You have to deal it with the current prices of natural gas, and you have to make an offer. So you see, Warmtestad can only manage the apartment buildings. And for the rest of the ground-based houses, we've got a problem. There are more distances, it's more difficult, and the prices are much higher. So how do we solve this? This is one of the big issues in the Netherlands. And as the city of Groningen, we chose to make it public. We just started our own Warmtestad with a limited perspective, but now also we help the other corporation, and we have to say, well, what do we do? Do we let it to the market or to make it public? And if we let it go to the markets, they will only get the low-hanging fruit and forgot the rest. But we think at the end, it's better to throw everything in one basket, and everybody have to pay the same price. And that's quite difficult because Warmtestad already began. They have many contracts for the lower price, and it's very difficult to make a new start, throw everything in it. And the next question is, what will be the basket? How big is your basket? And for natural gas and electricity, we have got a national basket. Everybody's paying the same. But our Minister of Economic Affairs and Climate is very delighted of the market. He's a market thinker, and he thinks the market will solve this. Well, that's we don't think it as a city, and that is a big question also in the Netherlands. So we've got a lot of technical problems and challenges, and also some financial challenges to solve in the nearby future. Well, that was my story. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's really excellent. To me, that just kind of brings home so clearly how important the role of local government is in connecting policy with the market and with the private sector, and the role of the private sector, and being able to interface with the people whose lives we're asking to change in a way from what they expect. So that is fantastic way of summarizing the role of local government. So just very briefly, one simple question, I hope, for you, Wouter, just on where is the green gas in the hybrid parts of the districts? Where do you see that coming from?
Yeah, that's a good question. We haven't got that much green gas in Groningen. We've got a sugar beet company, and that produces a lot of green gas. But for the future, we need not much more green gas, and perhaps in the future also hydrogen. But I think in the nearby we haven't that much green hydrogen, and it's too expensive. And when you have it, use it for the industry. So green gas is quite a problem. That's also a big challenge for us. And we think we can make more green gas from farmers and et cetera, but it's quite difficult.
And a question to you both, for both of you to address before we move on to the next panel. What is it that you feel you can do, and what are you doing in terms of learning from each other? Not specifically both of your cities, but although I'd be delighted if you already had a relationship, but from other cities' experiences, and in particular around the issue of getting the best from the private sector. So what is it that cities can do to ensure that the private sector comes in and does its bit alongside what you do and what national government enables you to do?
Should I take that? Start with that. I mean, it's really important, you know, as I mentioned, we can't do this alone. We don't have the funding. For London to meet its 1.5 degree aspirations, you know, to meet the Paris Agreement compliant plan that we've set out, we need in the order of £61 billion worth of funding. 10 billion of that is just retrofitting our homes. The amount of money that the government has mobilised, you know, is sort of 3 billion. Plus the money they've announced today, something in the order of 4 billion, you know, nowhere near the sorts of orders of funding that we need, or that, you know, Germany or France or the EU are talking about stimulus packages. We've created an energy efficiency fund of about £500 million that with the private sector helping to provide loan finance, but that, you know, that's still a lot more that needs to happen. So the private sector is absolutely key, both in leading by example, but also mobilising the private sector finance that we have. The recovery board that I mentioned, which has come together to help us recover from the economic and social impacts of the pandemic, is starting to bring people together in a way that hasn't happened before. There have been individual partnerships and networks, but now, you know, all stakeholders in London are mobilising. You know, the NHS, Transport for London, our business representative organisations, our local authorities, our community sector, churches, faith groups and others, to really focus on how we tackle the sort of economic recovery, and how we make sure that we tackle the climate emergencies integral to that. And that includes some of the, you know, taking advantage of some of the accelerator programs we have, looking to, you know, how they retrofit the commercial buildings, the NHS buildings, and so on. And I'm pleased to say a lot of them are already taking action and are saying they want to take more. And you'll see that in the run up to COP, I think, some of those examples. And we've used many good city networks, from C40 through to Eurocities, ICLEI and others, to really share best practice, you know, case studies and so on. So, and, you know, that's something that's really critical, so that we don't reinvent the wheel. Obviously, recognise that we have different sort of economic and legal systems, political systems, but there's a lot there. We learn a lot from the Dutch. We have a project called Energy Leap, which is based on Energy Sprong, you know, which is looking at whole house deep retrofits, but sort of area based, that we're working with social housing and local authorities to pilot that approach. And, you know, that's part of the government announcement today about that deep decarbonisation we need. So we want to make sure that we're actually retrofitting for deep carbon cuts, not that they're zero carbon ready, but that you're actually making the carbon cuts now. And that's something we'll be watching the building strategy, the heat and building strategy, to make sure that when we talk about zero carbon, we don't mean zero carbon ready for 10, 15, 20 years time. We need the cuts right now.
Absolutely, that's the need for speed, real cuts. Wouter, do you want to respond briefly to that before I move on?
Yeah, short add, I think, because the private sector is very important for funding, but also for knowledge. It's very important, innovations to find it. But there's one thing, everybody needs energy. So everybody needs energy for a fair price, and that's very important. And that's, yeah, if you join in the private sector, you need a lot of regulation so that everybody can join in. And that's quite an issue in the beginning. You see it on in the map I showed. So the strong public government is very important, I think, in the beginning.
Thank you, Wouter. Okay, we'll move on to our third and final panel. I'd like to introduce the panelists. First panelist is Ryan Jude. He's an associate at the Green Finance Institute. And he coordinates the Green Finance Institute's Zero Carbon Heating Task Force, which is convening actors from the supply chain and the finance industry to look at how we can accelerate the decarbonisation of heat in the UK. And after Ryan, we will hear from Martin Mooij from the Dutch Green Building Council. He is a program manager at the Building Council, including for the Deltaplan, which is about accelerating retrofit at scale in the Netherlands. So over to you, Ryan.
Cheers, Pedro. First, thanks for inviting us to come along today to speak about some of the work the Green Finance Institute is doing in this space. I just want to start by echoing what Danny said earlier around Netherlands being held up as a real example when it comes to leadership on the policy and deliverability side. Whenever we went to international best practices, our task force members always referenced the Netherlands. But also on a wider green finance space, it's actually a very timely discussion. The 10th point of Boris Johnson's plan last night was to make London the preeminent centre for green finance globally. And happily, until this year, London was sat at the top of that according to the Global Green Finance Index. Until 2 weeks ago, we were knocked off top spot by our friends over in the Netherlands, with Amsterdam taking the top spot. So it's not just with gas that we have similarity, it's also in the green finance world. There's also discussions around the green bond that have recently come out of London. And this is a full 18 months after Netherlands really led the way by also issuing its green bond. So there's many similarities, not just in gas that we can talk about and that we can learn from each other. Coming to specifically gas then, we've heard a lot about the challenges today, but I want to reframe the conversation slightly to an opportunity. This is how the private sector should be viewing this. When there is a lot of work to be done, it's a large investment opportunity. To quantify that slightly, the Committee on Climate Change has estimated that around 5 million homes in the UK are going to need to be attached to district heat networks to achieve our net zero targets. That comes in at around a 20 to 30 billion pound private investment opportunity. And if we look at heat pumps, the market's even larger. If we take, for example, say 20 million homes need to take heat pumps installations. And if we conservatively say the average cost of that is £10,000, we're suddenly looking at a 200 billion pound plus market. And that's before we factor in the fact that energy efficiency is hugely important. A fabric first approach is hugely important. And the fact that the estimations I just threw out there are conservative. It's a very, very large market, and the private sector should be excited by the opportunity it represents. That's where the task force comes into it and where the Green Finance Institute comes into it. So the work that we do at the Institute is we look sector by sector, and we gather up all the experts from the private side, from the public side, from the banks and from academia to analyse why investment is not flowing into a particular sector. And areas like heat decarbonisation are particularly good for this because the technology already exists. Electric heat pumps exist, district heat networks exist, but for some reason we aren't achieving the installation rates that we need to. And that's where we come in to look at the barriers, but also to develop innovative financial solutions to overcome these. And we work with the private sector to bring them to the market and actually get the real economy outcomes that we want. So before I go into some of the demonstrator solutions that we have been working on, I just want to quickly touch on some of the investment barriers that were raised by our task force members. On the private sector side, these are what you would usually expect to see. It's to do with scale, it's to do with certainty of demand, it's to do with certainty of cash flow, and it's to do with market signals. There's this misconception, I would say, sometimes that the private sector are the ones who take real risks, and to an extent they are, but to another extent they're also incredibly risk averse. When it comes to pricing financial instruments, it's all about being able to correctly analyze the risks and to be able to correctly price them. So the parts I just mentioned, certainty of demand, certainty of cash flow, and longer term market signals, if you can guarantee those, it de-risks the area, it de-risks the sector, and it can make pricing in financial instruments cheaper to consumers and to other businesses. So that's something that the Netherlands have actually done very well. since they announced their phase out of gas, the increase in demand of heat pumps in the following year increased by 50%. And that's something that we could see here with some of the signals announced last night. Previously, I would have said that we can learn from the longer term signals shown by the Dutch. It looks like we have learned with the £600,000 per annum target that we're going to be getting in the UK. Also, we need to look at the consumer side and the investment barriers for the consumer. This is more around education, but also the upfront costs. The £10,000 assumption I threw out earlier, that isn't the amount of cash that someone just has lying around. So then you have to look at personal finance and personal loans coming from banks, but also how do we decrease the financing costs? And also there's other areas around hassle, around accessibility, access to information, access to options. And these are all things that we're really trying to address with a holistic approach with our innovative financial solutions. Which brings me to some of the demonstrated solutions that are coming out of the task force. So we're actually going to be publishing this in a report in 2 weeks' time. So this is really the, I would say, public debut of a few of the solutions that we have been working on. So the first one of these is something called demand aggregation financing. This is a fairly simple idea that essentially does what it says on the tin. It looks to aggregate demand in a certain area and then marry up the financing to be able to provide consumers with the means to install, for example, heat pumps. What does that mean in practice? It means that if I wanted to install a heat pump in my home, I would register my interest online on my local demand aggregation financing scheme, and then nothing would happen. Nothing would happen until we hit a certain demand aggregated level threshold or critical mass of demand. Say 100 people, say 200 people. When we hit that level, suddenly this is quite a beefy contract that would then be shipped out to installers, to manufacturers who can competitively bid to take that contract. This overcomes the issue from earlier with scale and with certainty of demand because you're guaranteeing, at least 100 installations, depending on what the threshold number is. The thinking behind this is that the competitive angle to it can also drive down the costs to consumer, so drive down those upfront costs. So you're really getting a win-win situation. Then the real kicker from our side is that there'll be a financial institution or a bank alongside the scheme that will provide personal loans across the board to everyone who had registered their interest. This is great for the banks because instead of having to look at £10,000 loans every single time, suddenly that loan book's looking a lot heftier when you're coming in with 100 times £10,000 on a certain day. And again, scale taps into economies of scale, reduces costs. So it'll look to have this also be reducing the financing costs going forward. Another thing that we're working on is a lot more wider scale, and it's really two ideas in one here. It's a National District Heat Fund and a National Heat Delivery Body. So if we start on the latter, this has been mentioned multiple times throughout the call already. It's where we would have a centrally coordinated body with locally led installations and locally led solutions. But we would really be looking at it from the financing side. One of the key things that local authorities said as a blocker was the lack of expertise, but more capacity to run these schemes at a local level. This national body could ensure that they could loan out the capacity to help them. But more important from a financing perspective, as we want to move towards a more sustainable market for district heat networks, for example, a large issue in the UK compared to European countries is the ability to build a portfolio and to aggregate this demand and to make these ticket sizes larger. If you're coming in as a pension fund that would usually invest in this sort of thing after 3 or 4 years, you want to get out of bed for a few £100 million, not for a few £100,000. By having a centrally coordinated body, you can standardize contracts, standardize models, and make this all a lot easier as we move towards this larger market and this larger market share. Which also relates directly to the National District Heat Fund. So next year, we're going to be looking at the feasibility of exactly how this fund would be structured, but there'd be really 2 options for this. The first one is seeded by public money, and it would act similar to the way that the Green Investment Bank did previously, or any sort of national investment bank, where you'd be looking at public money leveraging in private sector money. The other potential option is to pool together the banks and the private sector. So another big issue here that we were talking about during our task force was that there are lots of opportunities, but not quite at the level that they need to justify the transaction costs involved. A fund in between could pool together this money, it could run the transactions itself, and it could allow access to that larger scale whilst we are looking at building new district heat networks across the country. And finally, that body could also then run some of the schemes that we're going to be coming out with. So the demand aggregation financing could be run by a body like this. So that's just 2 or I guess 3 of the things that we've been coming out with. There will be a suite of 10 of them in our report in 2 weeks' time, and I'll be more than happy to talk about more of them in the Q&A. But I just want to leave it with the fact that, I started at the start, that this is really an opportunity, and it should be viewed as such. It should be viewed as an opportunity to build back better, to build jobs in areas that need it, but also as a real chance for the private sector to show its muscle and to mobilize capital into coming over a very, very difficult challenge here. Cheers.
Thank you, Ryan. Really exciting work there. Yeah, we'll pick up some of those themes. I will move on. Who will give you his perspective from the Dutch Green Building Council. Thank you. Thank you, Ryan. Over to you, Martin.
Yes, thank you, Pedro. I will share my screen. So my name is Martin Mooij. I'm project manager of the Dutch Green Building Council, especially working on our Deltaplan, which is Dutch for a large plan that initially started in the 50s when we had the flooding. So it's a kind of double meaning in Deltaplan. Something about the Dutch Green Building Council. I think you in the UK will be familiar with the concept of Green Building Council, and we are in regular contact with the UK Green Building Council. And the second connection to the UK is that we as a Dutch Green Building Council are the BREEAM scheme operator in the Netherlands. So we're also in, let's say, daily contact with the BRE in Watford. We started our initiative, our Deltaplan. Of course, we promote a holistic approach, but especially this focus on CO2 reduction started after the COP in Paris in 2015, that we need to accelerate on CO2 reduction. And we have the network. We have about 350 members across the building sector. So from mainly commercial parties, so banks, developers, architects, consultants. And we have ambitious projects already in our database. So the idea was to transfer these lessons to the wider markets. So the 4 points in the Deltaplan was, at first when we started with it, how large is the sector? What's the general energy consumption? How is it? What is heat? What's the parts for heat and electricity? We were talking about mainly housing earlier in this session. In housing, let's say heating is about 80% of the CO2 reduction. For commercial and public buildings, it's a smaller issue. So the electric demand is higher than the heating demand. So that was just first to have this insight in the market and the characteristics. The second thing we thought, so what is the end goal for 2050? So what's what we later on called Paris Proof? What would be a Paris Proof building? Because that's what developers need to know. So not in a 5-year or 10 years plan, but let's say in a 30 years plan, what I'm going to do with my stock. Then the idea was to develop tools, roadmaps, all kinds of calculation tools to give a further insight in the measures, best practices, real projects. And the third issue is that we think we should do this together. So there's always been discussions between the energy supply, so the energy sector and let's say the building sector, or where to start, but I think we should do both, and we should do it together. And there's also discussions between parties, subsectors in the building sector on whether you should put your effort on insulation or heat pump or whatever. So we should do this all in the integral approach. And what we launched is that what should be the end goal. At the time there were discussions on the energy certificates and whether they give a good insight in what's really happening in a building. And we said what seems more logical than to have let's say the actual energy consumption, so the metered energy consumption as the indicator for the energy efficiency. That's very clear to communicate. It's easy to find out, and it's really where it's all about. It's not about the theoretical carbon-free world we want to be by 2050 in, but we want to be real carbon-free by 2050. So the second question we ask ourselves, so what should be this end goal? And we took a kind of reversed approach for this. So we said, how much sustainable energy do we have available by 2050? There are all kinds of reports and researches, and we recently conducted an update for that. Well, the impression was that we will have about 2/3 of the current energy demand available by 2050. So we said, well, the challenge for the building sector is to reduce on-site the energy demand by 2/3, so reduce or generate on-site. And then we will meet in 2050, or ideally sooner, 2050, to have this carbon-free end goal. So recently, 30 parties committed to this Paris-proof target, and we handed over these commitments, and we're still working on this to Frans Timmermans during the Dutch and the World Green Building Week. And so the methodology is, well, it's similar methodologies in the commercial sector, in the financial sector. So this is the reporting initiative that's done by the investors, the GRASP system, and they have a EU project. It's called the CREM project, and they developed roadmaps or pathways towards 2050 as well. For you can see this by the colors for the various sectors, so retail, offices, etc. And they have 1.5 and 2 degree pathways, and they're kind of similar with the pathways, even more ambitious than the pathways we developed. So it's also expressed in kilowatt hours per square meter. And you're probably familiar with the London LCAW initiative and the reports by the UK Green Building Council. There's a similar graph as you've just shown you for the Netherlands. This is based on the UK figures, and about so it's not a straight line, but I think the proposal is to have a trajectory of classes, efficiency classes up to 2050. And we're also involved in, and Ferdi mentioned some part of this, we're also involved in the elaboration of the Dutch climate agreement, mainly for the commercial and public sectors. So here we have working groups on also on the end goal for 2050. So here it's not our methodology that was chosen, but the EU cost optimality methodology was chosen. So that's what we discussed about the financing, and I've seen the first results of this now, and it looks good. So they're very close to the 2/3 energy reduction we think that should take place. So it looks positive. That's also the cost optimal solution leads to this ambition, but we're currently in the situation that nobody uses the EU cost optimality methodology, of course. So every sector calculates the cost optimality, and they don't have a 20 years time span normally. So we need to transfer this EU cost optimality to kind of calculations the various sectors use themselves on payback times, etc., etc. Secondly, all sectors have to publish roadmaps. They already did. With 4 scenarios, so it's about 30, 50, and 80, even 80% energy reduction, so 70, 50, and 20% renewable supply. And the second or third part is that all organizations, so investors, but also associations of organizations that have schools or universities, etc., they have to develop their roadmaps, so they can indicate their, it was mentioned before, their natural moments. And of course, an important natural moment will be the plans developed by the local authorities, by for instance, what Groningen showed, the phasing out of the natural gas infrastructure. And this will also a basis for enforcement. So the idea is that organizations can develop their roadmaps to the end goal, then they can pick and choose their own moments, their natural moments when to renovate a building, because this was asked for. Because we introduced legislation for C-label offices in the Netherlands by 2033, and then discussions arise from whether you should do C-label by 2023. Isn't it better to have let's say an A-label 1 or 2 years later? Well, develop your own map, and with the end goal, you have to achieve this end goal. And the third part, and I think this was what I started with, is that, and this also connects all these chapters, is that we need to have more insight in the energy stock and also the energy consumption. We should provide this to the owners and the occupiers. And we have a lot of data already available in the Netherlands, but well, all systems are not well connected. And this, with this, a perfect system or a better system would help a lot to give this insight and also to do the monitoring of this enormous challenge. Well, there's more available on our website. And I give it back to you for the discussions, Pedro.
Thank you very much. And that really is a good note to end on, because there are many big knotty questions, difficult questions and this kind of goes to all panelists. If I can kind of take it back up a level in a sense, is there's some really interesting challenges around how to govern this transition. What forms of governance do we have to ensure that the costs of changing the way that we use our infrastructure for heat, as we probably will be using a lot less of the gas network, and what the implications of that are for the consumers who are still on it, who pays for that upkeep, what this means for regulated tariffs, what it means for rights and obligations, basically, of all the actors involved. And such an interesting hallmark for me of the way that the Netherlands governs these sort of challenges across many different areas of policy, if I understand it right, is the agreement process, where it's clear what is expected and what will be contributed by the different actors in achieving particular policy goals, from the private sector, from consumers, from government, national and local. So this question, in a sense, back to you, is how do we govern the really knotty challenges of who pays, how everyone's rights and expectations of being able to have comfortable, livable workplaces and homes will be ensured. I'd just like some quick reflections at this high level from the panel about how we govern this transition. We know all the different pieces, but how do we get to the point where we can really manage a lot of these less technical risks, but the risks around people being left behind, the risks about people overpaying or unfairly benefiting, the risks of non-delivery is something we've already touched on. If we could have some quick reflections from all the panelists before we close at 12, that'd be a good note to end on. We will gather reflections at E3G and with the embassies on today's session, including some of the deeper materials that are there. But just this question about governance and how we, at a high level, govern this transformation in our infrastructure and what people derive from it. How do we manage that well, and how might we learn from each other? Who wants to go first?
Maybe I can say something about it from the Netherlands. Of course, we have, like every new government program, is looking very closely at the income effects of the new policies. And normally we have such a, our planning bureaus who plot in the graphic what will be the effects on the different groups. And normally we have long discussions about plus 0.1 minus 0.1 kind of percentages in improvement or on your income levels. And I think the energy transition needs a similar kind of discussion. So you cannot just say, well, we adapt energy taxes or we give some subsidies for certain kind of things without calculating and making transparent which are the effects for the different groups in society. So I think there's a lot of calculation to do, a lot of transparency to put on the table also of the political table, and then to have a decision on what to do. You have different strategies. You can just start with those which have the lowest income and the worst performing houses. You can also, from a political point of view, say, well, it doesn't matter who's moving ahead. We're just calculating the cost effectiveness of every euro in CO2 carbon reduction. And it doesn't matter who is doing this kind of reduction. So there are all kinds of political discussions, and you need some kind of scenarios, transparency on your strategies and the effects, not only on the climate effects, but also on the income effects. Considering also, of course, different phases where you're in. And I think one of the problems of this kind of climate agreements and climate plans and targets for 2030 and 2050, if you make a very general framework, but in politics, it's always about the coming 4 years. So you have to make it very concrete on, does it fix, can you explain it, and can you implement it in the coming 4 years, what you're doing, what you want?
Well, perhaps I can add something. I not totally agree with you, because I think what happens, the more individual approach you take, the more resistance you will meet, because you never can level everybody in a fair way. And I think one of the big things for governance is approach it in a collective way. Throw it in one basket. We do it now also with electricity, natural gas, water. Nobody knows what it costs. Everybody pays, and it doesn't matter where you live. And I think that's very important, because it's a very difficult transition we have to take. And the more individual, the more resistance we can expect. So level it up.
I want a short reaction, because I didn't promote an individual approach. I just promote transparency on your strategy. Yeah. And if you decide in one of your strategies to socialize the costs, well, that's fine. But in some way, you will have to make transparent who pays that. This will be a political discussion too. This will not be the discussion on the investment moment. What will be discussion about the distribution of who pays the energy transition, like on healthcare and so on. Yeah. So also that will be highly political.
Okay, thank you. I agree with you.
Thank you. That's marvelous. Who else would like to respond to this rather broad topic? But it's some interesting themes coming here about participation, inclusiveness, marrying the short-term political needs with the long-term strategy.
So I'll say something about that. And we will address some of these questions in the strategy that will be published later in the year. And there's limited stuff I can say on that. From a personal viewpoint, personally, I agree with that perspective that you're never going to get the perfect solution here, because it is always going to be a live political conversation. Right the way out to 2050, it will be a live political conversation. There will always be proponents of one way of doing things over another way of doing things, whether that's technological, whether that's socializing costs. And I think that means that we do need to be as transparent as we can about what the current approach and strategy is, so that can form a constructive conversation across stakeholders and across the public. And I think one reflection that I would have on the UK's position on that is that actually we currently don't have the institutional arrangements and frameworks to have that conversation in the right way with the right people at the right times. And that's something that I think we're going to have to work on going forwards, because we don't have all the joining up that we need, and we don't have all the ways of joining national and local approaches. We don't have all the ways of joining the political and the public consciousness, and that needs to come together quite quickly if we're really going to crack the kind of challenges that you set out, Pedro.
Thank you, Danny. That is a really important contribution to make. I think we do need to think really hard about what is the machinery, the institutional setup that kind of makes this work more organically, without consistently having to force the issue into areas that might make it harder than it needs to be. But yeah, to think about this high level framework. Brian, can I put you on the spot a little bit here? Just turning to you. I mean, with the pandemic crisis, and I will wrap up in a minute or two. I've seen the finance sector kind of, this has been a trend ongoing anyway, but it feels accelerated through the pandemic. The finance sector being more overt about its social role and purpose, in a sense, the stakeholder as opposed to shareholder benefits that derive from its activities. And I mean, how do you see this in terms of, where do you see the finance sector heading in terms of helping to achieve not just the opportunities you rightly set out, you know, what is the balance between capturing the commercial opportunity and you know, sealing the deal on the social opportunity here as well, and kind of bringing those two things close together?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree, firstly, that the pandemic has accelerated the discourse around this. I'd say that we've gained, you know, a couple of years of where we probably would have been on the normal trajectory. I just want to quickly start with, at the start of the pandemic, I think a very interesting trend was looking at the amount of capital that was flowing into, for example, renewable energy. A decade ago, renewable energy was a risky investment. Now it was seen as a safe haven and a safe investment. Mergers and acquisitions deals in renewables were achieving, you know, outsized returns, and also the people coming into them, which was obviously a fantastic thing to see. In terms of moving to stakeholder governance, this is very important. And again, something that has been evolving over the pandemic. We've seen now, with the pandemic being caused by us infringing on nature, that we need to also start taking into account the natural capital in the investments that we're making. And more banks are coming on board with this, and it's hugely important. It's an issue with how we look at economics in general and finance in general, that what used to be classed, because they couldn't quite figure out to calculate them, as externalities are now being slowly internalized. And as you internalize them, as you add carbon price, as you start factoring in the insurance costs that you're having to pay extra because some of your assets are going to become stranded assets, and you put that into a financial model, and when you put it onto a balance sheet and onto a cash flow statement, it actually gets reflected in the way that the financiers look at it in terms of value. And that's the real shift that we've been seeing over the last year, and more of a willingness. They don't want to be in a situation where COVID-19 caught the finance sector out because they weren't expecting it. The climate crisis is a crisis that we are expecting, and we can prepare for it years in advance, and it will avoid a similar sort of issue that we saw in the markets at the start of this pandemic.
I think with that, I would love to continue, but I think that's great, Ryan. I think I need to bring proceedings to a close. I'd like to thank all the panelists. I'd like to thank the embassy and the ambassador. I'd like to thank my team at E3G for enabling this to happen. And we will have a recording of this on YouTube. A number of people have been asking about this. There's a London Climate Action Week YouTube channel where you can see many of the events that are occurring this week. And we will piece together something really concise on some of the kind of key themes and reflections that have come out. And we just kind of like to put forward some propositions about closer cooperation and more dialogue between the UK and the Netherlands on this very important topic for the entire climate transition. So I'd like to thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of the London Climate Action Week, whatever else you're up to this week. And hopefully we'll speak again soon. It's been a really fascinating conversation, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.